Hello, debt warriors, and welcome back to another episode of Millennial Debt Domination. I'm your host, Katie O'Shea. Today, we're diving into a crucial yet often overlooked topic, the cost of childcare. Whether you already have children or are planning for the future, understanding the financial implications of childcare is essential. To help us break it all down, I'm joined by Simon Workman, a nationally recognized expert in childcare finances. Simon is the co-developer of the Provider Cost of Quality Childcare Calculator, a groundbreaking tool commissioned by the U.S. Office of Child Care that estimates the cost of running quality childcare programs across the country. In this episode, Simon and I will explore the different types of childcare options available, practical steps parents can take to prepare financially, employer-sponsored childcare benefits, and so much more. So let's get right into my conversation with Simon Workman. Hi, Simon. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Katie. Great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to you today. We're going to talk about something we've never talked about before. We're going to talk about the true cost of childcare, which is so relevant for so many millennials. So what are some of the biggest factors contributing to the total cost of childcare?
Well, really, the biggest factor overall is personnel costs, is paying the people to be in the childcare program, right? Unlike a lot of industries where technology or automation has been able to, impact the cost, ultimately taking care of kids, you need people, and it's a very labor-intensive industry, right? So really, we see the largest expense is paying people. And honestly, in order to take anyone who's got young kids knows that there's only so many kids you can take care of with one single person. So, when you look at a classroom, you say, okay, you have two children in there, you gotta pay their salaries, and that pretty quickly adds up.
Can the cost of childcare vary depending on your location, and why are some areas maybe more expensive than others? Why are some areas less expensive?
Yeah, I mean, really what we see is the cost of living in a different state or community really has a big impact on the cost of childcare, because again, the labor market that you're in is, you're trying to hire people, and those people are often other jobs they're looking at are, in Target, in Walmart, or in the sort of economy. And so a place that has a higher minimum wage, which is pushing up salaries, a place that is a higher cost of living place, a higher cost of living community, you tend to find that you need to pay teachers more. And if you're paying childcare teachers more, then you have to pass on those expenses generally to parents, right? So the cost of childcare goes up. There's a few other things, occupancy costs obviously, vary state to state, and you often see that in within state, right? In the big cities, if you're paying your market rate for the lease of a sort of childcare building, right, that can cost you a lot more. And then there's things like, liability insurance. We've seen a big one with liability insurance going up a lot in the last few years. And in certain states that's required, in some states it's not. And, those insurance costs can vary from state to state as well. So a lot of the things that you think of as being expensive for someone to live in a place, a lot of those things exist for childcare providers as well, and make the cost of childcare more expensive in some of those states.
Right. That's why it's kind of like they always say it's like expensive maybe for cities. It's more expensive in a city, right, than maybe the suburbs.
Yeah, I mean, it often can be because of a lot of those things. But then, what we sometimes find in some of the work we do working with providers in rural communities is their expenses are actually higher because they are, traveling further distances to buy groceries. The groceries are more expensive because of being in the rural community, or they're finding they need to pay people more to get them to come and work in that rural community, right? So sometimes you see the cities and the rural, and then, the suburban maybe being a little less expensive.
What about the differences in cost between like a daycare center, in-home childcare, and even hiring a nanny? What are the different costs?
Well, a nanny is definitely the most expensive. We've seen data that shows a nanny is about $40,000 a year, right? Which, is Obviously, again, varies depending on where you are. Some people make that work by doing a nanny share, right? I mean, if you have twins, maybe a nanny changes the things, but also if you do a nanny share with another family. Childcare centers are less expensive than a nanny. You're normally talking sort of 18,000 dollars a year, maybe $20,000 a year, depending on where you are. Family childcare, where it's childcare provided in the home of a childcare provider, right? They tend to be limited to sort of 6, 7, 8 children. Tends to be cheaper to the parents in terms of paying for it. There, we're looking on average more like $13,000 a year. But you have to sort of remember that's the reason it's cheaper is because that provider is generally a small business. They're not paying themselves a salary. So it's cheaper because they are not compensating themselves, which is great for the parents who, get cheaper care. It's not so great for that provider, who then is not able to provide for their own family quite so well.
What are the hidden costs of childcare that parents might not initially consider?
I mean, I think, just the fact of how expensive it is through and through, right? I mean, I've been in your boat where before you have kids, you don't think about childcare costs so much, right? You think you're going to need it, but you don't realize it can cost you, $30,000 a year if you've got a couple of kids, right? And more than your mortgage, more than anything else. So, I think just in general, the biggest hidden cost is just how expensive it is. But then even beyond that, right? Some states have, discounted childcare, or maybe you can get access to some childcare, but it's only for some hours a week, right? If you work 40 hours a week and you get access to some preschool for 20 hours a week, you've still got to cover the cost of 20 more hours or change your working hours or something. So often, a program might say this is the cost if you drop off at 9 and pick up at 5. But again, for your work schedule, maybe you need to drop off at 8 and pick up at 6. So then you've got to pay extra to cover, those times. Sometimes food is included, sometimes it's not. Sometimes the summer's included, sometimes it's not, right? Often programs offer great enrichment activities like, sports or yoga or something, right? Even for the sort of younger kids. Again, these are all additional things that can add up and be additional costs that you have to pay onto the childcare program.
And I think, do you think that these like costs may affect the parents' decision to return to work versus just like staying home? Because like sometimes that could be someone's almost salary.
Yeah, totally. I mean, if you think about that $30,000, if you have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, right? That's what, $14, $15 an hour based on a full-time work, right? If you're in a state where the minimum wage is the federal minimum wage, right, or something, where you could easily say it's not worth my while to go to work. But what you have to think about is there is some other lost income that comes from that, right? That what we've seen in the research has shown that sort of for every year you're out of the workforce, your long-term earnings go down. Right. There was some analysis a few years ago that sort of did some looking into this, and it really found that it's not only do you not earn what you earned that year, but then when you go back to work, you're often you've missed out on raises over these years, right? That then sort of compound. And if you're in a place where you've got a 401k and they're putting money into retirement, if you take 5 years out, you can find you're losing sort of 3-4 times your annual salary for every year you're out of the workforce. So it's a tough decision for families, right? Do I pay? Basically, sometimes I talk to people who are like paying for childcare, like they're going to work just to pay for childcare, which seems kind of crazy, but it is that issue of like, okay, long term, does this make more financial sense? It's a tough decision for families to sort of think through.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to ask you next is how does this affect a family's overall financial health and long-term savings? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. You have no ability to put money into savings because, if it's basically a second mortgage for most families, right? Because of what you're paying is about the same in a mortgage. So whereas if you didn't have children, maybe you could put some of that money into a savings account, you start building up. You are not able to do that because every penny you have is going to paying for childcare and all those other expenses that come of having a child. And you're delaying being able to start saving for college for kids, which then becomes another thing you start doing. So, it does really impact families' ability to sort of have that financial security in those early years. And, we also see a lot of families facing disruptions from childcare, where even if you have access to childcare, if that childcare center closes because it can't make enough money, then you're without childcare for a little bit, and then what happens is parents report all these disruptions to their work because of inflexible childcare, right? Because of unstable childcare, which then has a negative impact on your ability to take extra shifts, to earn money if you're an hourly paid employee, right? So this sort of broken childcare system we have really can have such a detrimental impact on people at this like really critical time of their lives, right? Sort of fairly
Right.
early in their earnings potential where they're growing into their careers.
I was gonna say it's kind of even like hard to be like I'm gonna wait until I'm in the perfect financial position because of the fact that if you wait, who knows when you'll be. But
Right.
but
Right.
what can you do to prepare financially?
I mean, I think, saving is really the thing to think about. When people have kids, they start thinking about college and they maybe start a, college savings fund and you have 18 years to build it up. I don't know anybody who thinks 18 years before they have a baby to start saving for childcare, even though the expenses are very similar. But I do think that thing of if you're in your 20s and you graduate college and you get a good job and you're like, yeah, I have all this flexible income, just even putting a little bit of that money away to think about, I need to be saving for things like childcare, for things like a house, right? Sort of even putting a little bit away, can build up over those years, right? So that when it comes to time for childcare, that maybe you have a bit of that cushion to either, take that year out of work or to, afford that childcare program that you really want, but like sort of seems out of your reach. So I think that's a key one. I think saving. I think the other is don't sort of underestimate the importance of employee benefits, right? More and more employees are starting to realize how important this is to their employees. More employers, sorry, are starting to realize how important it is to employees. So, you see when you're looking at benefits packages, some of them are offering childcare support. And maybe when don't have kids, you don't think about that. But if you're going to be in that job for a while, that could be a really huge benefit for you.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to ask next. So, what role can employee-sponsored childcare benefits or like an FSA, a flexible spending account, play in having children?
Yeah, I mean, it can be really a huge sort of help, right? When you look at sort of how tight families are having to sort of make their budget work with childcare, we've seen employers do everything from, offering access to,
Mm-hmm.
flexible spending accounts, right, and dependent savings accounts where you can sort of put pre-tax money in there. Some employers open childcare centers. They'll have a childcare center in their building, which is either free or reduced, or they'll sort of contract with a local community childcare program to sort of pay for some slots that then are held for their employees. All of that can be a really huge benefit. And it's a real recognition from the employer that childcare is a sort of necessary infrastructure to allow families to go to work, right? The only sort of problem you have to worry about is that sort of ties you into that company, right? In the same way, sort of health insurance has sort of historically done that. It becomes the same sort of thing of like, if your child is in an employer-owned childcare program, that sort of locks you into staying with that employer for until your kid is through that childcare, or you face the disruption of moving your child to a different program. So that's where like I think there's a huge role for employers to play in this, but they can't be the only player that solves this problem because it's not going to work for everybody.
What about any tax credits or government programs available to help offset the cost of childcare?
Yeah, there are things available, and really everyone should sort of check in with what their state offers. There's a federal funding stream, the Childcare Development Fund, that supports access for sort of what's termed like low and middle income working families. And every state sort of has slightly different requirements. Generally, you have to be working or in school, but the income requirements can really vary from state to state. And we've seen over the last few years, states really up those income requirements to sort of hit the middle where sort of historically very low income families could access some support. If you're high income, you can afford to pay for it yourself, and the sort of middle was squeezed. More and more states, Maine, Vermont, New Mexico, Massachusetts, are starting to sort of recognize there's the sort of working poor, right? That sort of you can be a teacher and a firefighter and still really struggle to afford childcare, and have sort of extended the supports that you can get. And what that means is that the state will sort of pay some portion of your childcare costs. and you're often asked to pay a sort of percentage of your income as well. But it does mean that then you can go to a childcare provider, and as long as they take that subsidy, that voucher, that can cover a decent amount of it. And that's really something we've seen through COVID. States used a lot of the COVID dollars they got for childcare to sort of support expanding that access. And then, we've seen these states really recognize the need to kind of keep putting that money in there, recognizing that families really can't afford the true cost of childcare, and need help. And it's not just the lowest income families that need help, but a lot of middle income families need help too.
I was gonna say they're probably the ones almost struggling the most to middle income, because it's like,
Right, because there are other programs. I mean, Head Start is available if you earn under 100% of federal poverty level, right? But there's a lots of people who earn above 100% of federal poverty level who still could not afford childcare, right? So that's a real sort of issue of the people in the middle.
how does access to affordable childcare influence career advancement and earning potential? I think we kind of touched on this a little bit too, like,
Yeah, I mean, I think, we see it have a big impact mostly on women, right? While,
right.
traditional sort of gender roles, we see men staying home as well, right? And it's not necessarily the man is the breadwinner anymore, but generally it is our research shows it's women that tend to stay home when one parent is choosing to stay home. And that does have an impact, right? Especially if you end up having, 2 or 3 kids and you're taking sort of 5 years out of the workforce, where you're going back to is going to be a different place. Your earnings potential is different. Your retirement savings are different. And the overall for the family, that means now you've only got one income coming in. And yes, you're saving some money on childcare, but you are then becoming a one income household, which does make it hard to be saving up for that bigger house, saving up to build up those savings for long-term financial support. So if you spend 5 or 6 years paying for childcare, that's a huge burden on your budget. We hear from families when their kid goes to kindergarten, they're like, thank goodness, like I've got a raise basically because
Yeah.
the kids went to childcare.
Is it almost, yeah, I mean, I was thinking about what you said before about how, like, oh, it could almost like set you back if you take this time off
Yeah,
and you're behind almost at work. Now you have a giant gap on
yeah,
your resume,
yeah.
and it's like, so a lot of people don't respect that. Oh, I took off to raise my kids, so it
Right.
could be hard to get that momentum going again.
Right, it's hard to get back into the career. It's hard to get back into the momentum. Things have moved on depending on what field you're in, right? Have you kept up with it?
Right,
And even if you
right,
do get back into it, right, maybe before you were like in line for a promotion, but now you're starting back, right? And so then you actually, a colleague who has stayed there has now got 5 years of cost of living increases and everything else, right? And bonuses and raises, and you haven't got those. And so that's where it's like, that's not to say that's not the right choice for you, but it's making sure you're not just looking at what do I earn and what do I pay in childcare, but you're looking at the totality of the sort of expenses that you're potentially giving up, the income you're potentially giving up.
right. And even if like one person makes basically what it would cost for childcare, at least they're kind of still working and still
Yeah,
in that workforce and learning and stuff.
yeah, exactly.
So, what should families consider when evaluating the value and quality of different childcare options? Because, we mentioned there are a bunch of different
Yeah,
options.
there are a bunch of different options, and they often vary a lot in the price. And families are very price conscious, right? They want the highest quality, but they're also like, what can I afford? I mean, I think I always encourage people. You've got to go. You've got to take a tour. You've got to meet the people who are working there. You got to sort of, a lot of it's on the gut of what you're feeling. Sometimes figuring out like, do the caregivers, have the educators been there? Have they got like a long tenure, or is there a turnover every year? Right? Children like stability. The development for children, very young children, the stability is important. So, to me, even more than the qualification they have, it's about, are they experienced? Are they sort of in this profession long term? So there's going to be stability for your children. It's also about how many staff there are in the program, right? This tension, how I started the conversation of saying personnel is the biggest cost driver. Well, the way then you try and cut costs is you try and reduce the staff as much as you can. But that can lead to sort of chaotic classrooms where, it's very overwhelming, where, your child is not going to get as much direct, supervision and attention. And so I think looking at that and trying to offset with, well, this is going to cost me a bit more, but look what I'm getting. My kid's going to get a bit more attention. And also just looking around the quality of the setting, the brain science over the last sort of decade or so has really shown that, like, it's not just babysitting, right? It's not just about keeping the child safe, which of course is extremely important, but it's also about how you engage in the child. Are they developmentally appropriate toys and games and colors and everything that's going to stimulate their brain and all the neurons that are firing in young children in those years. And then also just thinking about your child and what meets their needs. Like, do you want a place that, have you got a particular cultural background that you really want to make sure the program is reflecting, right? Do you have, certain needs for your child? Do you have certain needs for you as a family, that it's open at these hours of the day, it's close to my office so I can sort of go and see them, or it's close to my home so someone else can pick them up? There's a lot of things to sort of think about. A lot of it is about the feeling of the place. I also always encourage people to sort of check on how the staff are being treated. Are the staff compensated well? Do the staff get good benefits? That seems like an odd question sometimes to ask a director on a tour, but are you paying your staff minimum wage? If they're paying the minimum wage, then they're more likely to leave and go to another minimum wage job where they don't have to change diapers, right? And deal with the sort of all the stress of that. But if you're sort of treating them as professionals, they're more likely to be acting as professionals, right, and taking care of your children in that sort of more professional way, rather than just being a paycheck.
And I was just thinking like, because if I'm looking up a place, I want to look up reviews, but it's almost kind of hard to get reviews because the parents aren't there all day with the kids.
The parents aren't there all day, and you can't ask the kids, and like,
because they don't know.
Right. And honestly, if you ask most parents, is the quality of the childcare good? They say yes, because ultimately, like, you have to decide it's good to leave your child there, right? Because otherwise you just couldn't walk away. Lots of states do have these sort of quality rating systems that they've had over the years that have attempted to try and do that, right? Almost like the restaurant ratings of like, are they a 5-star, 4-star? There's always questions about, are they measuring the things that you want them to measure, right? Sometimes it's like, do they have toilets at the right height? Are the water temperature right? Sometimes it's about, the materials they have in the classroom. But, there's a style of teaching, Montessori it's called, which is much different to sort of a more traditional teaching, right? The rating systems don't catch that. So the rating systems can be one of the sort of things you look at, but I wouldn't only go on it, right? And it varies state to state of how sort of intense those rating systems.
So what advice would you give to parents who maybe feel overwhelmed by this financial burden of childcare, if there's any advice?
Well, I'm not going to lie, it is hard, right? And like, there's no silver bullet. I guess, remember it's time limited, right? I mean, it is a period of years, unless you're having lots and lots of children spread over a long period of time, right? It does tend to be time limited. So maybe that means that you can, you put off buying that house, for a few years, right? Or, thinking about it before it starts as well. I mean, I think, before you become a parent, like, think about, that these are expenses you're going to have and how much you can either do to save for that, or even thinking about, not buying the house or the car payment at the absolute max of your limit because, maybe you're expected to get pregnant in a couple of years and, then that's going to be tough. I also think, like, this is a broken market. There are lots of people out there trying to make this case that it costs more than most families can afford. We need more public support for it, more public investment. As a country, we've sort of decided that, like, once a kid hits 5, it's a public good and we educate them. But before 5, you're on your own. And in the old days where you could, get by on one income, maybe that's okay. But most of our communities are set up where you kind of need 2 incomes to buy a house, to sort of buy groceries, etc. So we really need more public investment. So, I mean, one thing you can do is turn some of that overwhelm into advocating for more public resources. That's hard because you have a kid under 5 and that's really hard work. But I do think, trying to make the case of why and sharing how childcare is really expensive is important. But otherwise, just, do good budgeting, think about it being as part of your budget, know that this is a priority for you, it's a priority for your kids. And if that means, you've got to change some of your other lifestyle in terms of like Starbucks and other expenses, right? Remember, it's time limited, right? That, like, you can, when they go to kindergarten, you can go back to getting your coffee every day, but right now, make you drip coffee at home.
No, right. I think that's great advice. Simon, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
This was very informative.
Oh, great to be with you. Thanks, Katie.
The true cost of childcare can be surprising, but planning ahead makes all the difference. If you have children or are planning to, start by determining whether you'll need childcare and exploring all your options. Whether it's hiring a nanny, using in-home childcare, or enrolling in a daycare center, thoughtful planning is key if you intend to return to work. Yes, you might need to cut back on some extras, like those daily coffee runs, but remember the investment in quality childcare is worth it in the long run. Budgeting becomes more important than ever when you have kids to ensure your finances stay on track while covering childcare expenses. That wraps up another episode of Millennial Debt Domination. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. And if you're tuning in on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please take a moment to rate and review us. It really helps. I'll catch you next time, Millennials, Gen Z, and everyone else joining in the conversation. Bye.